Hi there, thank you for joining. It's Ray with Tarot Living. So today we're actually going to do tarot lesson number 2 in our series of 8 tarot lessons that we're working on right now. If you haven't already, please go to tarot lesson number 1, and in there I also do a recommendation of being sure that you have clicked on the right section in YouTube in order to get email notifications. So when I post a video, you're able to get that right away. So if you haven't yet, please go to tarot lesson number 1 to get caught up. So tarot lesson number 2, we're going to actually do look at elements and suits, and in particular what they call elemental dignities. So essentially it's like saying, is in terms of element, is a card well dignified or ill dignified depending on what other suits or elements are next to it. What card combination are we looking at? So do we have suits and elements that speak the same language? Do we have suits and elements that speak the opposite language, and that weakens them if that's the case? So that's what we're going to actually be looking at in more detail. So I hope you enjoyed this. Tarot lesson number 2 on elemental dignities and information about elements. All right, so let's talk first about some of the qualities or characteristics of elements. So just for beginners, of course, we've got the 4 elements here, and I've just made a little sign to help us a little bit. So we've got fire, air, water, and earth. Fire are wands in tarot, air are swords, water are cups, and earth are pentacles. So the 4 elements relates to the 4 suits of the tarot deck. So when we're looking at the 4 elements, we can actually determine some of the characteristics of the elements by how they're separated out. So they have different characteristics. So there is something called a polarity in these 4 elements. So a polarity means that there's going to be 2, it's divided by 2, and so therefore there's going to be 2 that are masculine. So fire and wands are masculine, air and swords are also masculine, and water and cups and earth and pentacles are both feminine. So you have 2 elements and suits that are masculine, which are here and here, and 2 elements and suits which are feminine here and here. And that is the polarity. Some of the characteristics of masculine, and I'm going to give you a list if you want to grab a pen and paper. So masculine is active, outgoing, extroverted, yang energy. They're more direct, assertive, outward, sustaining, concrete, autonomous, and self-motivated. They also have a focus on the self, and the power center comes from self. The feminine characteristics for water and earth are receptive, indirect, passive, introverted, withdrawn, receiving, soft, intuitive, nurturing, and tendency to look outside of self for advice and verification. Okay, so the next most important thing, and what we're really wanting to get at today, is how do these elements relate to one another? How do they speak to each other? Because we're going to get combinations of cards that come up in readings, and we're going to have to know what happens if, what would it mean when. So let's talk about this, and I've put this on my sheet just to help you out. Now there are many different ways to write this out. There's 4 elements, therefore there's 4 points on a circle or a cross or however you want to write it, and you can plot them however you like. I've plotted them this way because for me, in a natural astrology chart, Aries starts on the left-hand side over here, and so wands to start there made sense to me. And I put the opposite one there, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then air made sense to put up and earth below. So that just made sense to me. You can plot them however you like. This is just one example that will hopefully help you out. So let's talk about the ones that weaken each other first. So in other words, they're going to be opposite from one another. So the fire element is opposite from water, and that makes sense because water will put out fire. So they are not friendly, they weaken one another, And if you have them come up in a reading together, then you know that those opposing energies are weakening one another, and there may be flux between these two aspects of life, or these two characteristics of the elements that are showing up. The second one that weakens each other is air, which I've put above, and earth below. So that makes sense. Just think about air up, earth down, and those weaken each other as well. So again, a masculine that goes with a feminine, and these two in particular weaken each other. And then you have some that strengthen each other, and those are going to be easy to remember. So it's going to be our fire and air, which are both masculine, and they strengthen each other. And that makes total sense because they speak the same language. Water and earth are both feminine, and they strengthen each other. Okay? The other two, we won't get into as much today, but they basically neutralize each other, and that's fire to earth and air to water. Now, it's hard to remember all of these, and so I'm just going to give you a little trick. One of them is quite easy to remember, so what I always think about is fire and earth, and I use the acronym friendly enough. So they're neutral, or they're friendly enough is what we call them. So they're not best friends, they don't strengthen each other, but they're friendly enough. So FE, friendly enough. And this one, there's a backstory to this, but WA, wah, if I say wah, it's just a backstory of something that occurred one time with this little kid that was learning how to talk. So that's just a personal memory for me, but you have to use your own. Maybe you want to go, AW, or whatever it may be. Use acronyms, use whatever way you need to in order to remember these. I hope that helps in terms of understanding the four elements, and then also how they relate to one another. So now let's talk about elemental dignities. So again, when it's in its elemental dignity, it is at its strongest point. So if a card is sitting next to, if it's a sword and it's sitting next to another sword, it's going to be well dignified because it really can express its full potential. Now it's going to depend on exactly which cards come up and if they're difficult or not so difficult as to whether it's at its best, position of being dignified. But the point being that if it's in its same suit, it's going to be in its same polarity and its same suit, and it's going to be well dignified. If it's ill dignified, it's going to be weakened by an opposite. So if a sword, which is air, remember above, is coming in with an earth card next to it, then it will be more ill dignified because there is a difficult position, there's a difficult combination. And what I always like to say is it's not speaking the same language. So we want to look at whether they're speaking the same language or we're not speaking the same language. So now what we're going to do is actually lay out some cards where I'm going to show you some examples of when it's going to be well dignified and when they're not going to be as dignified, and also what it will mean if we have a large number of cards that are, say, in the masculine or a large number that are in feminine, and what does that really mean. So let's lay out some cards. Okay, so the first example we're going to look at is two cards that I've chosen that have obviously a polarity of masculine energy to them. So you can see that we've got the Three of Wands and we've got King of Wands. So both are going to be wands, so they're fire. So they are masculine energy, and these cards will pick up very similar characteristics of what we already talked about, which is the active, the outgoing, feeling very sort of centered in oneself in order to go ahead and make decisions or actions, that kind of thing. So this is telling us that if we pull these two cards, we know that this individual has a significant amount of masculine energy around them right now, and that they're not going to have difficulty with clear focus, being direct, pushing their energy out in order to make something happen, to accomplish sort of externally. being assertive enough, that sort of thing. So very self-motivated. So that's just an example of two cards that if you did pull them, you can say not only the meanings of the cards, which is going to be obviously, how I would read that would be an incredible sort of entrepreneurial, business person, somebody with a lot of fire and energy who has made their way to a certain point, which is the 3, but there's yet more to come. And so they're going to really use that as a launching pad in order to create something even further. So that's how I would interpret that. But you can also add now to your interpretation that you recognize the polarity of these two. So you recognize that they're both masculine energy, and therefore you can weave your information in about what masculine energy or masculine polarity would be about. So that's how, it's an example of how a significant amount of wand energy can be looked at in terms of the elemental kind of dignity, that it's really very much in its dignity. It's very well dignified. It's in its highest sort of expression if we look at it this way. So there's a great example of wands. If we added in a different card, but it's a sword this time, and I've just mixed up the decks here, but just to make it quick. But we still have the 3 of Wands, and now we have the King of Swords, so we again have another masculine energy. So it's not quite as well dignified as if you had wand and wand, but it's extremely well positioned because they're speaking the same language. They're speaking that outgoing, more masculine language. So if the King of Wands comes into play, what I would say about this one is that this individual has created something to a certain point, but now there's going to be a lot of a point at which you even want to use your logical mind and reasoning and analyzing in order to perhaps make some very savvy business decisions going forward. So that's just an example, a couple of examples of if you pull cards that have masculine energy. So now let's look at some other types. All right, so in this example, we're actually going to talk about when the elements are opposite to each other and when they are weakened. So the example that I've chosen is when we take Pentacles and air. So remember, air and earth are opposite to each other. So air is above, earth was below in the chart that we were looking at, and it does weaken each other. So they are not speaking the same language. So for this particular one, this is, I'm using a little bit of extreme examples occasionally here so that you can understand the point to what I'm saying. So let's look at the Knight of Swords. So it doesn't really get more masculine in terms of characteristics than the Knight of Swords. Knights in general are active and action-oriented, and they're all about change and activities and doing, and very adventurous, outgoing, so very masculine energy. And then we have swords, which is intrinsically, a masculine element as well. So he's all about, I've got ideas, I've got thoughts, let's put this into action, let's move now, let's move quickly. He thinks quickly, he does things quickly, and he wants change, and he's very adaptable and flexible, and let's move quickly. The 8 of Pentacles I've chosen as the opposite card, and you could use really, any of the Pentacles or, any of the Pentacles for this, but I chose the 8 of Pentacles to make a point here. So 8 of Pentacles is actually astrologically Sun in Virgo, but not that that makes much difference here. The point is that the Pentacle is all about manifesting in the physical realm. And Pentacles just have a tendency to move a little slower. They're working on things that are very tangible. It's not about ideas and thoughts. It's about bringing those ideas, thoughts of the wands and the swords, but they're actually manifesting in the physical realm. So we're kind of earthbound with Pentacles. And 8 of Pentacles in particular is a card that is known for really representing someone who works very diligently at developing a skill and works over a long period of time to do so. It can be about an apprentice or someone who is working very hard within a job. And it's really about diligence and patience and becoming good at something over a long period of time. Virgos are the, kind of great at self-refinement and striving towards self-development. So he is Sun in Virgo, this Eight of Pentacles. So my point is, though, that he's really patient and he's working over a long period of time to create something. And Knight of Swords is coming in saying, but I just want to do things very directly. I want to do them outgoing. I don't want to internalize and do self-development and self-refinement. I've got an idea and let's just run with it. So these two are really opposite to each other, and they're not going to work well together. So if somebody were to pull these two cards, they've got two opposing energies, or really a flux, between these two opposing energies. And so the question becomes, those energies are likely, fighting against each other, or perhaps they need to be aware of the two energies that are working, and maybe those aren't actually helping them move forward, because one of them wants to move forward quickly and the other one wants to actually take its time and, let's develop our skill and become good at something. So if you were to have this come up in a reading, it's really like saying you've got two very different energies that have come into play here. And really, there's probably going to need to be some reconciliation or some kind of compromise on one level or another in order to bring these energies together, in order to bring things into more harmony and balance. It perhaps means that the Eight of Pentacles needs to accept some of the, very unique and can be very brilliant ideas from the Knight of Swords, and the Knight of Swords needs to recognize that it may be good to slow down. So I think they can learn from one another, and so it may be really about creating some kind of balance and letting the person know that they have two very opposing energies going on, which if they keep, sort of fighting against each other, they may not be able to manifest and move forward as quickly. So there's an example of some opposing energies and my thoughts on that, and how I would potentially look at that in a reading. Okay, so our last example that we're going to look at today is where we have put together Four of Cups and Four of Pentacles. So what is that? So water and earth are both feminine. So they are speaking the same language, and they are of the feminine polarity. So they're going to be really bringing in a lot of the feminine characteristics, being receptive, passive, introverted, more withdrawn, yielding rather than moving forward, more inward, tendency to need to look to the outside in order to figure out what to do, not sort of as much belief in oneself just as a self from the internal to the external actions. So we're going to talk about the fours, the fact that we've got two fours here in a minute, but let's just talk about this first. So we know that because they are both feminine, it's actually well dignified, so they are strengthening each other. So in that sense, just setting aside the meanings of the cards, which we'll go into in a minute, and there's some issues there, as we can see, but just the fact that they're both feminine means that they are strengthened and that they're well dignified. And in fact, they're both fours, so we have a real similarity going on here. So these cards are really speaking the same language. Now, here's when it brings up, pardon me, this is a great example of when we see a reading where they're speaking the same language, but we also, as tarot readers, have to take a look at whether that energy, whether it be the masculine or feminine polarity, or whether it be numbers, a pattern of numbers, is there so much of that really there's some kind of learning or warning or information that client needs to know? Is there some other element they need to think about and meditate upon and bring into their lives in order to be able to move forward fully? So here's an example of when you've got potentially too much passivity. There's potentially too little progress that's moving forward. This individual may feel like they're being controlled by other things, and they're not in control of their situation. They're not actively moving forward with something. They're actually kind of sitting in that passive position. And then let's talk about the fact that there are two fours. So what do fours mean? So you can go back into the information about numbers in some of my other videos. But fours really are talking about that stability and structure and order and form, everything that is very solid. You know, think about four being the four corners of a box. You know, we know the box. You know the sides of the box. It's familiar. It's predictable. You know, it's very stable. But the problem with being in a box is that there's significant limitations. So you will never get outside of the corners of the box unless you actually step outside the box and take a chance and move to something different and grow and change. So there's kind of an intrinsic limitation that comes with the number 4, despite the fact that there's great stability. So if you add in a bunch of feminine energy in the feminine polarity and you add in 4s, you've got quite a lot of passivity there and quite a lot of yielding and stagnation and not moving forward that you're going to actually see represented in this reading. So if someone came to you and they were asking you about an issue, you would know immediately upon pulling these two cards, or when them pulling the two cards, that they're not moving forward here. They are really stuck probably in a certain position, and that they're going to have to get outside their comfort zone in order to learn and grow. So that brings up the question, if you have a lot of passivity, say you've got a lot of feminine energy that comes up in a reading, we should be, as tarot card readers, suggesting to that individual that they may need to get in touch with the more masculine, more direct energy in order to help them move forward. So you can say, hey, you know, you're really in touch with the inward, more feminine energy principles right now. If you are wanting to change, but you're having difficulty, you know, perhaps meditate upon those more masculine, outward, extroverted, direct principles that are within you, and find a way to sort of step outside of it through using those energies. So that's just an example of how an energy can actually be very well dignified technically, but if it's so much of it, then it's up to us to really say, hey, we're seeing a lot of this in this reading. And so if you're wanting to find a solution, the solution is really to try and find harmony within your elements, within your polarities, within all 4 elements. And so you can talk to them about that and bring that into play. So I hope this has helped in terms of understanding some of the, obviously the 4 elements, when it's going to be strengthened, which is when it's in its feminine or masculine principles, when certainly you've got, weakened sort of positions where things are opposite to one another. And maybe sometime we'll go into more of the neutralities, but for right now I think that that's enough for one lesson. I certainly hope this has helped you in terms of understanding elements and polarities, and understanding when those are well dignified and when they're maybe not so well dignified. So have a great week. I will probably not be posting next week. It is my 50th birthday celebration. So I will be doing that next week, and then we'll come back to you with lesson 3 the week after that. So take care of yourselves. From Tarot Living, have a great week.